Very good. So thank you for attending the conference today on whiskey. It is one of the most, among liquid subjects, it is the hottest currently in the market. Whiskey is becoming extraordinarily fashionable, especially as the United States has taken from its two main companies, Diageo and Beam Suntory, the lead to break out into the global market. And we had a media phenomena a couple years ago where if you're looking at the screen right now, you'll see an array of different types of whiskeys. These are Japanese whiskeys at the top, and then on the bottom you'll see some single malt scotches on the far right, and then in the middle some Canadian whiskey where it says Canadian Club, and then to the far left, bourbon. And we're going to talk about each of these today with the exception of Japanese whiskey because we're strained on time. But you will get to know the main global whiskeys that are out there, and then the ones that you'll need to know in order to interact with your clients and cater to their needs, and then understand what it is they're asking for. Because nowadays people have become much more specialized in their understanding of whiskey, and their expectations are a lot higher. They are looking for authenticity and identity as the number one factor, because this is American bourbon, for instance, is the most regulated product, or most regulated alcohol product in the United States, and actually also in the world as a consequence. So that's one of the reasons why people are looking to these particular products outside of wine, because wine, while it still remains popular, this is something new that people, have found a great draw to, because it comes from so many different places. It's more diverse than wine, at least in terms of its origins, and there's a history behind it. That while wine has a great history, whiskey is a little bit easier to understand for people, in particular because it's all in one language. You don't have multiple language barriers that exist, particularly in understanding governing bodies in each case, in each country. So without further ado, let's go ahead and go to the first slide. So what is whiskey? Number one, the most important fact, it is glorious. Whiskey is awesome. It is incredibly diverse. You can make it from almost anything as long as it's a grain, and it will turn into an array of different and diverse types of flavors. I hope after today you will leave thirsty, and more importantly, experimentally so, that you're going to, when the next time you're at a bar, a nice bar that you can find, I would highly recommend asking the bartender to give you the opportunity to just try a taste of something. Because you're going to learn from different styles today. There are going to be different things that you'll like that maybe you didn't know you liked, and also things that you'll be very curious to try. But the main thing is whiskey is a type of distilled alcoholic beverage that is made from fermented mash, grain mash. So it can be any type of grain. Some of the grains that are used include barley, corn, rye, and wheat. So some of you are very familiar with Scotch. Scotch is made from barley. Corn is the main ingredient in bourbon. Rye is the main ingredient in rye whiskey, which is also becoming extraordinarily popular. And then wheat, of course, is a much softer style of whiskey, which it tastes a lot like bourbon, but it's much more approachable because the alcohol level doesn't tend to be as intense. And some of you might be familiar with Pappy Van Winkle, some of these other big names out there, and a lot of times those are wheated whiskeys. You can go to the next slide now. So first, the E. This is very important. Whenever you have correspondence with a customer, a client of any type, always check your spellings, because if you want to appear informed, this is always the first checkpoint is going to be the spelling, and it does make a difference. There's a lot of rivalry that happens between England, Ireland, and Scotland, and which is how I think this originated. There aren't any specifics on their various ideas on why the spelling is different, but Scotland is the first to raise the banner of a no E spelling of whiskey. So I'll go over the first few rules. The easy to remember rule is if the country of origin has an E in the name, whiskey is spelled with an E. The plural also changes to EYS, not IES. Like wine, of course, whiskey is geographically focused, so the recipe is dependent upon the place of origin. So if you can see that there's an E in the name, then you can say automatically, all right, well, I have an idea of what type, what style, and we'll learn what that is, what style of whiskey this will be. And if it doesn't have an E in the name, I have maybe a premonition of what that style is going to be like. Now, each country regulates how their whiskey is to be prepared, and for both taste and taxation purposes, there are actual audits of distilleries to guarantee authenticity. And unfortunately, we didn't have time in this case to go over it, but Scotland is one of the first and foremost to give a key to the taxman to the distillery. There's a small box inside the distillery. And actually, Glenmorangie, which is the picture that you're looking at now, this is home of the the tallest stills in the world. And in this distillery, they have a small box where drips of some of the stills end up based on the quantity, and based on what's in that box, the taxman locally in the Highlands will then tax accordingly to what they're producing in terms of quantity. So that's why oftentimes, we'll go over this a little later, barrels are so significant in how they're placed in a distillery, because you don't necessarily want the taxman to have the ability to count everything. And then the last thing, of course, is authenticity by identity is what drives the price of whiskey in each category. And, of course, this is why bourbon is the hottest thing on the market. We'll go over this a little more later on, because it is the most, as I said, regulated beverage in the world, has the strictest requirements for origin and creation. And for all of its purposes here, Glenmorangie, the single malt producer in Scotland, they have been one of the first to also guarantee purity, which is why their stills are the tallest in the world. As a whiskey is distilled, if you're not familiar with how distillation works, the mash, whatever the grain, corn, barley, rye, is placed in the bottom of a pot still, and it's boiled, and then it creates alcohol added with yeast, and then that rises up. So the stills here, as it rises up, it becomes more and more pure. So very short stills, like moonshine stills. That's why moonshine, in many cases, if it's a homebrew recipe, especially back in the day, could kill you, because the stills were so short and small. They were just looking to get fermentation. They weren't necessarily looking for purity, and a lot of very bad toxic elements, different compounds and alcohol, are filtered out in these tall stills because of their weight. They can't reach the very top. Only at the very top do you get the maximum amount of flavor and the purest form of the alcohol. So as I was saying back in American history, these little stills would often produce blinding elements of alcohol, because the purities were so heavy. They would block the function of your body. So we want tall stills. Tall stills are good. All right, so we can go on to the next slide. And this is to give you an idea of how large those stills are we were just looking at are. So that's the base. That's just the boiling point. That large portion that you see is not actually held up top. So if you look to the right side, you see the still, and it has its tall giraffe neck, and then below that is part of the pot still. But actually, you're only seeing the top part of the still. Those stills are another full story tall. They go all the way down. So these gentlemen are on the second floor. But what they're trying to do is create in the second portion of the still, which sort of grabs it like the neck and reduces very quickly a number of the compounds that might have reached up toward that far up the top. And this will block anything else that has a certain weight from going above, and will get as much of just flavor, but not impurities up top. And you can see how small these men look relative to the size of even just the base of the neck, relative, and then, of course, to the height of the still. The stills are at least about 5 stories tall. We can go to the next slide. So if you see here the cross of St. Andrew, and this is the flag of Scotland. And I think the most important thing to look at first is something that we're all familiar with: single malt Scotch versus blended Scotch whiskey. And as you can see, Scotland, as I said, they do not have an E in their name, so of course they're going to spell their whiskey without an E. It is by coincidence that that's how the spellings work out. Again, there isn't any precision or precise reasoning as to why these countries only spell without an E if they don't have an E in their name, but it is the rule that's been adopted. And as you can see here, I've given you two examples. Glenmorangie, which is a very common single malt Scotch that you've seen around, and what we just saw, their giraffe neck stills and their distillery. And then, of course, Johnny Walker. Everybody knows Johnny Walker, red, black, blue. And I'm using these as the different examples to show you the difference between a single malt versus a blended Scotch. That's very important that we understand that the difference between a single malt and a blend is not intended to be snobbish. Sometimes people say, I only drink single malts, and another person says, well, I can't afford that, I only drink blends. But actually, either of those can be voted the number one whiskey in the world. It happens every year, and a lot of people don't realize that. One doesn't make you better than the other. It is common that more often than not, single malts do produce a superior whiskey over blends, and that has to do a lot with the aging process and how they're distilled. But many times blends can be and are often worthy of trying and consideration, particularly if you're interested in getting into Scotch. I highly recommend trying blends first because they tend to have a much more approachable character. And as you can see from the details here, Glenmorangie, as an example, a single malt is distilled from one distillery only. It's made from a single type of malt, and that is barley. It's made in pot stills. The goal is to achieve a very distinct style of one type and consistently the same. So every single year, it's meant to taste exactly as it tasted the year before. And then finally, they're often very peaty and very smoky. So you might be familiar with Lagavulin, with Laphroaig. I'll have some pictures of these later to help introduce you. Lagavulin, Laphroaig, Ardbeg, these are all single malt Scotches that are extraordinarily smoky and very peaty. And based on where they come from in Scotland, they occupy a particular style. We'll have more on that in a little bit. So, for example, in the Johnny Walker, what's a blend? A blend is from multiple distilleries whiskey. So what does that mean? That means that you can have Johnny Walker is not a distillery in per se. They can make, if they wanted to make their own whiskey, they could. But Johnny Walker, for the most part, is simply a label. It doesn't have a physically existing set of stills. They simply purchase whiskey from other distilleries like Glenmorangie, Glenlivet, Glenfiddich. It could be from any number of places, and then blends them together to create a certain type of whiskey. So as you know with Johnny Walker, they have their entry-level red label, then they have their black label, then they have their gold label, then they have platinum, and then they have blue, and then they have green. These are all meant to be a consistently different style, and each category or each label is going to be either smoky or sweeter, etc. And they're trying to appeal to a larger audience than, say, single malt Scotch, which for a long time was actually had a very, very low market share. And because of the recent coverage that it's received in the media, particularly with a Japanese single malt that came out, all single malts across the board have taken off. And likewise, these are also they're single malts, because they're a combination of single malts or multiple distilleries whiskeys, they're a combination of single malt barleys with corn and grain that's added after the fact. And that often gives it its approachability and its added sweetness and its character, which is why, let's say, if you tried Glenmorangie versus Johnny Walker, it's likely that if you're not very familiar with Scotch, you'll find Johnny Walker much more approachable than you would Glenmorangie, because Glenmorangie tends to be smokier, tends to be peatier, tends to have a little higher acid, whereas Johnny Walker is meant and intended for people who want to try something that's going to be smoother, easier, more approachable. And then, of course, the blends are intended to be consistent year to year. So in this case, what you'll notice that this is common to both of them. So Glenmorangie, they have a very distinct style. They stick to it. Johnny Walker, distinct style. They stick to it. I mention this in both categories, in both cases, even though we're trying to show differences, because both also have something very, very big in common. And this is where it's very helpful for you as a concierge to help your clients. Many don't know the multiple labels available by each, or the multiple, excuse me, the proper term is the multiple expressions available from each label. Johnny Walker is a label. Glenmorangie is a label. It also happens to be distillery, but it is a label. There are multiple expressions from each of these labels. Those expressions are what really give you a leg up in above a lot of other people, because many will say, oh, I know Glenmorangie 12 year and I know Glenmorangie 15, but did you know they make a La Quinta de Ruban, which is their sherry cask? Did you know they make a port finish cask? Did you know they make a very rare, it's literally called very rare, 18 year? Did you know they make? And they think, oh, wow, I had no idea. Yeah, maybe I should try some of that. Also, as we all, depending on the structure that you're working within, in order to upsell a client, this is a great opportunity, because you can say, you've had Johnny Walker Black Label. Have you had Johnny Walker Green Label? Have you had? And so knowing the distillery that a person likes, it behooves you to learn what other labels are available and where those price points are, because especially if it's a special occasion, they may want to have a bottle of their favorite whiskey, but they may not know, oh, by the way, there's a single release coming out this year made in very small quantities, and it's called Whiskey X. You should really try it. I think you'll like it. So important things to note here, though, are that the single malt Scotch is distilled from one distillery, and blended whiskeys are blended from multiple distilleries. And Johnny Walker, I hate to bust everyone's bubble, but they don't really exist. They're just a label that happens to buy other people's whiskey, and this is extraordinarily common. You'll see in a map later on, particularly in Ireland, how few distilleries there are in existence. Actually, let's go to the next slide. Relative to what we think of both Scotland and Ireland in terms of what they produce. So this is a funny little picture, because it heats homes and makes you nicer. Well, how does peat bog make you nicer? Well, it's what makes whiskey, and what makes the single malt style, and particularly in Scotch. This is what makes Scotch famous. Which Scotch over Irish whiskey, over bourbon, over other types of whiskey, everything that Scotch is right here. This is a peat bog. So the entire area that you're looking within is a soaked area of peat. And peat is used to heat homes. It's used for fuel of every type over in Scotland. It's still commonly used. And one thing that they do is they burn this and then allow the smoke, if we go to the next slide, the smoke to then come through the floor of where the barley is. And you can see the barley being smoked right now, and this is actually, I think this is also Glenmorangie. And that smoke that comes through the floor then gives the smoky character to single malt Scotch. So if you're ever wondering how they get it in the bottle, this is it. This is the raw, unadulterated secret. There are little tiny vents in the floor that then allows that peat bog that we just saw one slide before, when it's burned in an oven, which basically this entire floor beneath it is an oven, and it's got tons and tons and tons and tons of the peat bog, and it's set on fire because it catches fire very easily. It's highly flammable. It will then create the smoke, and that's about as complicated as it gets. So this is a very simple result of a long time ago. The only way that people had to be able to heat and dry the barley was to do it this way. It was to bring the heat, and how they provided heat was through peat, and peat then created a smoky character. So then the Scottish became known as having smoked and very smoky whiskey, and then a lot of other things that they produce often is smoky. That's why curing salmon, for instance, a smokehouse. It's the same result. Scottish salmon is traditionally extraordinarily smoky for the same reason. It's just a very practical tool that was used in production long before electricity. And in this case, it's stuck. It's a distinct style that happens to taste delicious. We can go to the next slide. So here are some examples of some single malt scotches that are well known in the market and you might have seen before. You'll see Lagavulin, third from the right, and next to it, of course, is Talisker. Talisker is very common. Two over, then right next to Lagavulin is Pittivac, which is, I believe, out of production, as is Port Ellen, which is very rare. So these two are very interesting, rare scotches. If you have single malt fans among your client base, these are great names to remember and know. because they are rare. You can find them. In fact, Sherry's, the store that I run, we do sell these. Not all of them, but we sell the Pittivock, Port Ellen, Kailua, which you see on the very far left. The 10-year, we sell that. Interestingly, that's their unpeated whiskey because as most often scotches in Scotland are actually peated. Now many distilleries like to say, you know what, we're going to be a little different. We want to go a little bit like the Americans. Let's see what we can produce that could be a little softer, a little sweeter. So Kailua came out with the unpeated whiskey. So that says a lot about our influence in the market when you consider that they've been doing this for about 1,000 years, and we've come into to existence in terms of our whiskey capabilities for the last 200, and we're already having an impact. We can go to the next slide. And here are, this is a taste chart, a flavor profile chart, which I find very helpful. Sometimes there might be a distillery. Now, at this point, I know all of these distilleries, but you might have a customer ask you, listen, I'm looking for this particular style of whiskey. Do you have any recommendations? They could say, you know what, I'm really not into the peaty and smoky thing. I would prefer to do the more, a little new world, like newer style. We go something that's a little more floral and light. So then you can look at it, you can say, okay, on the far, so down on the far left corner, as these are arranged by flavor profiles, you can see smoky, rich, delicate, and light on the edges. You can grab, let's say, okay, you're a 10-year. That's one of the closest Rosebank 12-year. Those will be delicious, and all of these are widely available whiskeys. So if you want to keep and hang on to this, I would recommend it. If you have people asking you questions about whiskey and what you would recommend, you can see a very common name that everyone knows, or everyone should know, is the Macallan 10-year. So if you look over by the rich side, on the right side of the chart, almost right smack in the middle on the equatorial line there, it says Macallan 10-year. Macallan is meant to be right smack in the middle. It is a very globalized style. It is aged in sherry casks in addition to the oak casks that it goes through. It's meant to be very rich, but it's also meant to be as palatable as possible to as many people as possible. It is also extraordinarily popular in the Asian market, and this is due to the style that they've employed in this case by finishing it and making it not smoky, but not delicate, but just rich and light, right in the middle. So I recommend, yes, learning this chart, get to know it, and it would be very helpful. As you can see, it's a very, very tippy top, Lagavulin 16. That's one of the most smoky Lefroy and Ardbeg. It's a very top on the far left. Ardbeg really should be off the chart, but for the purposes of tasting here, they're unwilling to admit how incredibly campfire-like this single malt feels in your belly. But the Ardbeg 10-year is extraordinarily smoky, and in fact, Ardbeg has another whiskey, a label that they came out, or excuse me, Brooklady, which is a sister company to Ardbeg, came out with a whiskey called Octomore. Octomore is the most smokiest whiskey that has been scientifically engineered in history. I actually have a bottle of that here in the store, and it is 293 parts per million of smoke. So essentially, that means you couldn't, if you set yourself on fire, you couldn't be any smokier. They've engineered it to be exactly as much like you're eating ashes. But, some people really like that. And frankly, it's a cool gift to suggest to someone because more than anything, it is the smokiest whiskey in history. I do believe that you reach a certain point when you're starting to engineer a lot of these whiskeys that once you've made it so smoky, you can't, the human palate can't distinguish a difference, and sort of like the way we can't with sound. You get to a certain point, it's no longer distinguishable and sensible, but it certainly makes for a good story. The next slide, please. So, we've studied Scotch whiskey. Also in the kingdom here, we've got Irish whiskey. And notice that, of course, Irish whiskey is spelled with an E. Remember, Scotch whiskey, always remember, is never spelled with an E. Irish whiskey is a very different style than Scottish whiskey. Irish whiskey is meant to be extremely approachable, ready to drink now. It's supposed to be a little bit on the sweeter side. It's a little more junior in style, although they do make some whiskeys that have by far beat the heck out of a number of single malts that are available. But Irish whiskey is meant to be extremely approachable and on the sweeter side. So it's almost like the bourbon of United Kingdom, of the British Isles, of that area. So Irish whiskey is usually unpeated. It is the least regulated among global whiskeys. It's very simple to make. It doesn't take a lot. You can pretty much, as long as you license your distillery with the taxman, you're good to go. Distilled 3 times. Scotch is distilled twice. Now, the reason they distill it 3 times is they're not as concerned about flavor. If Scotch were distilled more than twice, it'd be very difficult to retain as much of the smoke and heat. So that's why the stills are much taller. So if the Scotch have this idea, if you're going to do it right, if you're going to do it right the first time. So which higher stills are much more expensive, particularly with the amount of copper that's employed in their use, and then it has to be refinished and refurbished at least 4 times a year. And in this case, the Irish they're not looking to do that. They're looking to just produce something that's sweet and drinkable now. It is aged for at least 3 years in wooden casks, so that's where, if you're looking at whiskeys, where do they get that color, that brownish color? Sometimes they do add caramel character, but it's from aging whiskey in wooden casks. Wood imparts a lot of flavor, and this was just a practical matter of needing to transport whiskey. Wine was the same way, from one place to another, and because they were originally, everything was done transportation-wise on ships, things sat in oak for a very, very long time. And as a consequence, whiskey would begin often white, sort of the way we understand moonshine or white whiskey now, but by the time it arrived to its destination, it had turned a brown color, and people didn't realize, oh, so thanks for sending me this brown whiskey. I am so excited. Meanwhile, the merchant on the opposite end of the shipping rod was mortified, thinking, oh, it's been ruined. But it turned out it was a very popular style, and then in the history, just people kept it for that way forever and ever. Irish whiskey is often divided into 2 types, Catholic and Protestant, based on their location in the north or south of Ireland. This is just a fun little fact. You'll find particularly people who are either from Ireland or who are older Americans living in this country that have a strong attachment to Ireland, they will only drink, let's say, Jameson, and they'll say, oh, that's Catholic whiskey. And then if they're offered Bushmills, they will not drink the Bushmills because they will say, oh, no, I don't drink Protestant whiskey. So if someone ever says that, don't be offended. They probably don't indicate any religious leanings, but there is a strong attachment still in Irish-American culture to this idea. And Jameson and Bushmills are the 2 major distilleries in Ireland that to this day still have a huge following here in the United States, and actually was brought in and raised in popularity by Americans. Very few independent bottlers exist. That is, very few Irish distilleries purchase their whiskey from a distillery and relabel under their own name. Let's say in Scotland, this is an extremely common practice. In Ireland, they don't do this. Why that is? You don't really need to purchase whiskey. If you can distill it 3 times and it's not regulated, you don't have to peat it, you don't have to add things. You can afford to make your own. You don't need to go and purchase from someone else, which is very, very helpful. And it also means that there is there is per capita a larger number of distilleries in Ireland than there are in Scotland, because Scottish distilleries are extremely expensive to maintain. Next slide, please.
I've got a question here for you, Ryan.
Sure.
Yes, the question is, does distillation increase the alcohol content, or does it just mean higher purity?
Higher purity. So once you're distilled, you're going to come out at a certain alcohol level. But once you distill again, you're going to start decreasing it, but only by very, very slightly. So if you're looking at the majority of whiskeys that you've tasted on the shelf, a lot of them, it's curious because they'll all have the exact same alcohol by volume. That is 40% is usually the average. Single malt Scotch tends to be bottled at between 43 to 50%. 50% is on the higher end of the average, but it does happen. But 43% is most common. Irish whiskey is closer to 40%. The reason that is that they are not what is called barrel, or as you'll see in the case of bourbon, but it is barreled at cask strength. So cask strength means it comes out of the cask as is, and it is not diluted. Nothing is added. Nothing is thinned out. It's put in the bottle exactly as it came from the still and then into the barrel. This is very, very uncommon to see on your average shelf. but here in Washington, D.C., cask-strength whiskey is extremely popular. You could make a connection between the function of this city and the fact that they prefer higher alcohol beverages, but certainly it's not uncommon to see cask-strength, but more often than not, you will see just around 40%. So everything comes out of a still around 57%, and that's if you distill it 3 times, 4 times, 5 times. Anywhere after 3 times, you really see very little increase. So if you see vodkas on the shelf, for instance, which are distilled 6 times, it's usually just more of a marketing ploy than it is actually doing anything for the flavor of the beverage. But it's the function of distillation is to increase purity. But if you have extremely, extremely tall stills, again, you don't need to do that because the impurities can't reach that high into the still. Next slide, please.
Perfect.
So here is a map of all the distilleries, just to give you an idea. So whenever we think of Ireland, at least my perception of Ireland was that people were drinking whiskey all the time, and that there would be a lot of production of whiskey. But actually, relative to the size of the country, there isn't as many as I expected. I think we have in total 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, around 25 different distilleries. And this includes distilleries that are also planned. And you can see planned is in light blue. There are a lot of planned distilleries relative to the existing number. And that's because we have now happening in the world a globalized rush on whiskey. There is a liquid rush, liquid gold rush. And you can see to keep up with the demand relative to before, you have Bushmill, you have Kilbeggan, the Irish distillers, Cooley. Wow, they left Jameson off the map. Where is it? Where is, looking for, that's terrible. Well, I apologize. They left the Middleton Distillery. I don't see Middleton on here. Middleton is the name of the Jameson Distillery, which many of you probably know. Anyway, that is a great example, though, of how the global market is moving and shifting. Relative to the existing distilleries, which are 4, you see about 15 to 20 more plants, and that's crazy. It's just utterly crazy. I think there's also been some legislation that's recently been passed in Ireland that does give a break on taxation, as well as incentives to open distilleries, in addition to even lowering already existing regulations to an even lower point, so they become more competitive on the global market. So we can go to the next slide. So here we are, back in the United States, in one of my favorite beverages, bourbon. I like bourbon. I've always liked bourbon. My mother, as a kid, I remember she would say all the time the only thing she would drink 2 things. She would drink bourbon and rosé champagne. Though she does not have cheap taste, she's got taste that I definitely copied as an adult. I do appreciate bourbon for a number of reasons. One, if you taste bourbon relative to a number of other whiskeys out there, there is a whole lot of nuance because we are the most regulated. And let's go through these facts here real quick. It is produced in the United States, and this is to be classified as a bourbon, the legal definition of a bourbon. You have to be made from a grain mixture that is at least 51% corn. Which for the rest of it you can add rye, barley, etc. It doesn't matter. But 51% corn is the main number one thing, and this is why bourbon is generally sweeter. But you can have 60% corn, 70% corn. You can still be a bourbon as long as you fit the next criteria, and that is you must be aged in new charred oak barrels. New charred oak barrels. That is a decision that was handed down from a man called the Reverend Elijah Craig, which surprises a lot of people because they don't expect, particularly back in the 1800s, that many in the clergy, at least in the Protestant clergy, were hawking hooch. But he had an accident in his barn, where he had a lot of barrels where he was storing alcohol, and he had new barrels, and they were burnt in a fire. And this is a true story. Those barrels, because he was very keen on preserving and saving money, he wanted to use them. He didn't want to toss them out because barrels are very expensive. They cost anywhere between $1,500 to about $3,000 in current U.S. dollars per barrel. So it's not cheap. So he decided to use them, and then it found that it imparted a flavor that was magical and really helped a lot. So what does that mean? Aged in new charred oak barrels. Literally, someone reaches inside, the char master will take a blowtorch, or they will put these staves that make up a barrel, which are the individual planks you see inside barrels. And actually, if you could go to the next slide real quick, just so I can show what a barrel looks like. You can see the barrels here, and these are all bourbon barrels. Now, actually, very interestingly, these bourbon barrels are all in Scotland. And the reason they're in Scotland is because in America, we can only use, to make bourbon, you can only use a barrel one time. So think about how ridiculously expensive that gets and why bourbon is often pretty expensive, about $50 or more on the shelf, just starting at an entry level. And you can see the black on those barrels. Those are all charred barrels. They've been at least lightly charred. There's no definition of how charred you have to be. You can see the one on the current, like down the bottom right corner of the picture, is very lightly burnt. And that could be because that one bourbon distillery wanted to create a style that was going to be lightly toasted versus the one next to it on the left, which was extremely toasted. So if you could go back to the previous slide. So aged in new charred oak barrels, and new, brand new. Use it once, then you're done. So that's why you saw them in Scotland, because these bourbon barrels are often, because bourbon is so popular, they will sell their barrels to Scottish distilleries, and they will make scotch, and then the Scottish distilleries will make profit off the fact that they say aged in bourbon barrels. And if you start looking on the shelves now, look at scotch labels and see what kind of barrels it was aged in. That's a really helpful way for you to assist your clients in understanding what it is they're going to be tasting, because you can say, okay, well, I know this scotch is going to be peaty because it comes from this part of Scotland, but it's going to have a little bit of extra sweetness, or because it was aged in a port or sherry finish, it's going to have less sweetness. So start looking at the different types of finishes. Finishes are a very popular and great way. Johnny Walker is a pioneer of that, of adding style and substance to whiskey from the usual styles. So then distilled no more than 160 U.S. proof, but it's 80% alcohol by volume. Then it's entered into the barrel for aging at no more than 62.5% alcohol by volume. So once it goes in the barrel, the alcohol can be increased, but it can't be increased to any more than 62.5%. Then it will be bottled like other whiskeys at 80 proof or more. So it's 40% alcohol by volume, and it has to be at least 40%, and which this all makes it the most regulated spirit in the world, because this is very difficult to do. We have to distill it at a certain level, enter it into the barrel at a certain level. And so if you have barrel-proof whiskey, which barrel-proof bourbon does exist, it's usually around 57.5%. It is very, very strong. I highly recommend trying a barrel-strength whiskey if you can find one, because it gives you an insight into how much nuance and richness that there really is. Think of it, barrel-strength whiskey is really the fat of the whiskey. I mean, you don't want to lose and find and filter that. You want to keep that as much as possible. But at the same time, you also want to be able to have more than one drink. So for practical reasons, we have to bring the alcohol volume down. All right, we can go to the next slide. And, of course, the barrels, again, can pass this one. So just some real quick figures and stats. Bourbon accounts for $1 billion in exports of the $7.4 billion American spirits industry. Total sales are close to about $3 billion that's sold within the United States and what's exported. Canada consumes the most of our American spirits, and bourbon is also on that list, followed by the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and Australia. It's great for your international clients. And then those that follow are Brazil, Israel, and the UAE. The Arab world is very much into whiskey. They like Scotch quite a lot. Johnny Walker is one of the most popular in the Arab world, but they prefer the upper labels of single malt Scotch. But bourbon is slowly making headway in there because of that introduction. And then 2015, we had an unfortunate slight decline because global whiskey production is growing in every other country. As we saw in Ireland, it is incredibly off the charts, considering that they only had a few distilleries, and now they're about to have a gazillion more. So the competitiveness for American whiskey is definitely growing. We can go to the next slide. So, different labels, same whiskey. So we talked about that before. You'll have labels. This is also true. These are all examples of bourbon, actually American bourbon. Maker's Mark, which many are probably familiar from, one of the original whiskeys, one of the original major bourbons that was on the market. Blanton's, Four Roses, Angel's Envy, Eagle Rare. A lot of these all come from the same distillery. And how is that possible? Why would someone want it? It's just like the Scotch model. We do the same thing. We have a distillery. A lot of these are actually produced from a massive production plant in Indiana. And I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head. But for your purposes, it helps to know that that whiskey is then sold to a number of American distilleries, and it's made in the bourbon style. You'll notice that bourbon does not have to be from Kentucky. This is a common misconception. Kentucky is one of the original birthplace of bourbon, but it does account for 90% of bourbon production, but it still has about 10% of other whiskeys produced elsewhere here in the United States, or other bourbons are made outside of the state. But looking at these different labels, many of these all have whiskey from the exact same thing. Maker's Mark is an exception. High West makes their own Wild Turkey, though Wild Turkey, Blanton's, Four Roses, a lot of their whiskey comes from the exact same place. It's what they do with it after the fact. Some will just rebottle it and repackage it and market it to a different clientele. Some will go younger, some will go older. But this is helpful for you to know the source of your whiskey for your own clients, so that if they're looking for a particular style, you can say, well, I know that whiskey comes from this place. You know what? They probably really like this label, and they never even know it. So you can go on to the next slide. So these are some of the rarest bourbons available on the market. If you're ever looking for someone who's really wanting to get a collector's item, these are the first 5 to go to. Handy Sazerac, which is a straight rye whiskey, so it's just the rye. William LaRue Weller, or also known as W.L. Weller, that's a Kentucky straight bourbon. The George T. Stagg, also a bourbon, Eagle Rare, 17-year. And Sazerac 18-year. These are all, they come into my store and they last, and I mean this by no exaggeration, they will last for 5 to 10 minutes. People know the days that these are released, and I'll maybe get 2 bottles of each, and each of these will sell from anywhere between $300 to $600 a piece, and their actual value, their cost price from the companies that we receive them is around $40. And that isn't because we are necessarily inflating the cost and people are against it. It's that we've inflated the cost because the demand is incredibly ridiculous. So go ahead and we can move on to the next slide. Here's another example of extremely rare American bourbon, Pappy Van Winkle. Everyone has heard of this name. This was, the whiskey is no longer in production. It's whatever's left is just in barrels. They don't make anymore. The distillery doesn't exist. So they barrel what's left and then sell it on the open market. Each store, if you're a retailer who sells whiskey very well, you'll be able to get a number of these different whiskeys for a pretty inexpensive cost. But the real resale cost is extremely high. So you can see the list price above. Increase each of those numbers by about $100, and as you get higher, increase by anywhere. Let's see, the most expensive. Let's say the second most expensive, the 20-year whiskey at $129, so that's suggested retail. The last time we sold that, it was for $2,000, and then there was a bidding war. So whiskey, American bourbon in particular, this is all 100% wheated bourbon, by the way. So it's 51% corn at least, and then the rest is wheat. And, of course, you get this particular style that everyone must have. We can go on to the next slide. So that concludes the presentation. I hope that, I know it was a lot of content. It's always very difficult to sit with the group and discuss a lot of this, knowing that there's so much content to get through, and I really can't believe it has already been almost an hour. It feels like it's been 5 minutes. So I will go ahead and open it to questions. If any of you have questions.
The conference has been unmuted.
Go ahead with questions.
Does anyone have any questions?
I do, Ryan. This is Carol.
Hi, Carol.
And I'm curious, I know that champagne has to come from the Champagne region in order to be called champagne. And is American bourbon like that you can only call it bourbon if it's from America and it's made to the standard?
Yes, it has to fit those criteria in the slide. Yes, absolutely. It has to be made in America, and it has to be aged in a new charred oak barrels. Must be at least 51% corn, and must be bottled at least 40% alcohol, 80 proof, so 40% alcohol. And then it has to come out of the barrel at 62.7 or less. But yeah, it must be made in America. Kentucky and there's no state. You could make bourbon in California if you wanted, but yeah, it has to be American.
Okay. How long does it take?
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, one of the issues that we have, though, in enforcing that law is that, unfortunately, the United States doesn't agree to a number of treaties that exist which regulate name recognition. So the United States at a federal level does not sign on to the Champagne Agreement, which is a common agreement that says if you are going to use the term Champagne, you must be from Champagne. Various AVAs, wine-producing areas in the United States will agree to it: Napa Valley, Sonoma, Russian River, Walla Walla. But at a federal level, like Korbel, that's why Korbel can still use the term Champagne, because at a federal level they've been lobbied against it. So it's very difficult for us to, So we can't enforce the law abroad because we refuse to enforce it at home on other areas.
Interesting.
Yeah. Anyone else have any questions? And does that answer your question,
Vanessa has her
Carol?
hand raised. Vanessa, do you want to go ahead?
Okay.
Yeah, well, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay. So we went over the single malt, blended malt, bourbon. So how many different types of whiskey actually are there, or is it just the ones that we covered?
So you can, in essence, you can create, as a whiskey is anything that's distilled from a grain, you can create any type of style, but really there's no requirement to making or to fulfilling in order to be considered a new whiskey per se. So if right now, like let's say I made a whiskey in Ohio, and I made it from less than 51% corn, I wouldn't be a bourbon, I would simply be a whiskey. So there's really no definition for me to say, well, you know what, I want to make Ohio whiskey. If I want to make Ohio whiskey, I can try to draft legislation that'll say, okay, you have to be made from at least 39% corn, and the rest has to be rye. And that's what we're going to call Ohio whiskey. It's too daunting of a task. So everything else outside of the main whiskey production or existing whiskey production areas, it's just called whiskey. And you can have French whiskey, you can have, and it's geographically, as I mentioned before, the geographical indicator is the number one go-to identity. But if I had to say the three that we discussed are the main types of whiskey. You also have Japanese whiskey, and then everything else is just whiskey. And Japanese whiskey is a Japanese single malt, the same thing as a single malt, a Scottish single malt, except it's made in Japan. And if you were, because these styles are also defined, that is that single malt is a certain type of thing. We just happen to know Scottish single malts, which we call Scotch. If you were to make a single malt in, let's say, the UAE, you would simply be, United Arab Emirates single malt. You would be UAE single malt. So there really isn't a whole lot of room left because the definition has already been defined as being or been noted as being anything that's distilled from a grain, which is really broad.
Mm-hmm. So
but
Scotch
the main types
is whiskey.
Yeah, the main types are what we discussed, plus Japanese whiskey as well. And then everything else is just whiskey.
Okay, so Scotch is a single malt whiskey.
Yes, Scotch is a type of whiskey that is from Scotland. Scotch is whiskey from Scotland. And then
but it would be a single malt.
We have two types of whiskey. We have the single malt and we have blended. So the single malt is from one distillery. The blend is from multiple distilleries.
But a Scotch would be considered a single malt from Scotland, or a blended malt, or could it be both?
It could be both. Yeah. It just has to be a whiskey from Scotland. Yeah. But they only make those two types.
Okay.
But it's only Scotch if it's from Scotland.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there a specific way to drink whiskey, or is it just preference?
So Yeah, I think there is. It's preferential. It begins and ends with a smile. So whatever fulfills that criteria. But I recommend always trying your whiskey first, just by a sip. You don't nose your glass the way that you would nose a glass of wine. You'd probably pass out. The alcohol level is so much higher. So I would recommend you sort of quaff it far above the glass. And then if you'd like, you can add a drop of water. Sometimes you'll see medicine droppers at nice whiskey bars so that they can add just limited amounts of water. But an ice cube, if you want to add an ice cube, it's however you want it. But I recommend experimenting because you'd be surprised. If you have a whiskey without water in it, and that includes bourbon, single malt Scotch in particular, because of the way it's made, tends to respond to water in a very dynamic way. By adding just a drop of water to it, it opens up a large phenolic compound experience that is everything that's related to your nose. And I would start with that, and then after that, if you want to add, an ice cube to your Johnny Walker, I think that's totally acceptable. But definitely experiment with different styles. But a drop of water, ice cube, and then plain, those are the three main ways to usually do it.
And when you say a drop of water, you mean like literally a drop of water?
Yeah. Yeah, right.
Okay. Is the color indicative of strength or mainly just flavor in the way that it's aged?
It can be indicative of flavor and age, but because you can caramelize, you can add caramel color. A lot of times it's difficult to tell. So if something, but usually it does indicate how it was aged. You'll find at least some level. If you add too much caramel coloring, it can kind of skew the profile a little bit, so people are a little reluctant to add a lot. So it's not as bad as, like let's say some food products out there which are processed to, into oblivion. In this case, usually the darker the color, the longer it's been aged in a different type of barrel. That is, new American oak does not impart a heavy color, but if you age in a, let's say, port finished barrel or a sherry barrel, something that used to hold port, something that used to hold sherry, you will get a typically much darker color. Well, the whiskey that's in front of you on the screen right now, it's lighter in color. That is an aged in new American oak, and that's generally the color. It's the golden amber color. Anything darker than that, it's been aged in something else and or aged a long time and had added color.
Is there anything on the label that would tell us if color has been added, if it's not just due to the processing, but somebody actually added color? Do they indicate that?
Because the spirits industry is not nearly as regulated as the food industry, you do not have to indicate anything such as that. You don't have to indicate if caramel color was added. You don't have to indicate. The only way you would know is if you research the distillery and try to find out in very interesting information, by the way. I mean, I think it's a great question. That is usually not available because they protect their recipes and they lobby so hard to have their own particular style and then have it protected by law that they don't have to disclose it, that they don't want to get into that game. So unfortunately there's no way to know what's in your glass, and to be honest with you, with some cheaper liquor, it's a blessing that you don't know what's in there because it would scare you. Like $2 Chuck, for instance, it's a great example from Trader Joe's. I don't know if anyone drinks that wine, but I hold no prejudice against anyone, but I would like to extend your life as long as possible. I would highly recommend you don't drink that. It contains, massive levels of arsenic, and there are a lot of other products.
Wow.
The wine that also have that, and people don't know, and that's because you're not supposed to know.
And this is Trader Joe's.
Yeah, that's the Trader Joe's. Yeah, the $2 Chuck, Charles Shaw wine. Yeah.
We'll stay away from there.
Any other questions?
Can we get a copy, or Pat, can you send us a copy of that flavor chart? That would be extremely helpful.
You bet. I'd be happy to.
Can I put this up on our chapter Facebook page for the other members who didn't get to attend?
It'll be available on the website or on the Ready Talk site, and they will all get that information. So not yet. Good. And then once it's not on Ready Talk anymore, so they'll all get an announcement saying that this is available for them to view. And then once that's off, then it goes on our website. So.
Okay, so I'll just let them know where they can find it then.
Yep, we'll send an email to everybody.
Perfect.
Yep. So if you find somebody that didn't get it, please feel free to share. But yeah, every member will get this. So, any other questions for Ryan?
Anyone else have any more? Yes. Sorry.
I just said, any other questions?
No, this has been great. Thank you so much.
It's been wonderful.
welcome.
I live in Salt Lake City, and in fact, my husband's going to the bourbon bar tonight with one of his managers. So it's a popular thing here in Salt Lake City.
Oh, yeah, perfect. No, Utah, they have High West Distillery out there. I highly recommend if you can get to High West, it's worth worth the trip.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody.
Yes, thank you for
participating.
Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you so much, Ryan, for being with us tonight. We appreciate it, and your knowledge is always great, and I'm sure we'll be tapping it for more wonderful sessions.
Thank you.